What's up, everybody? This is a video on the major historical context of the First World War. So kind of the things that you need to understand about Europe and the Eastern Europe and a little bit of Africa during the time period pre-1914 to better understand why the First World War is starting. So generally when we look at international conflicts or global conflicts, we try to think about how we can categorize long-term, short-term, and immediate causes, and then even try to categorize them off of that by explaining significance and different perspectives and things like that. So there is a guided note sheet which should be posted on the at-home assignment right underneath this that you can click on, and you can help take some notes or go back afterwards. So we'll start, and again, the nice thing about having a video is that you can pause me at different times or speed me up if you want to. People say I sound like political commentator Ben Shapiro if I am on 1.25 speed. Maybe don't do that while you're taking notes, but it can be a funsies activity afterwards. So our focus question here is, to what extent, so again, one of those to what extent questions, big, little, significant, insignificant, to what extent did long-term issues in Europe make World War more likely in 1914? Now this is key, more likely, which means that without having this happen, war would have been less likely. So not was it like the cause, but to what extent did it make it more likely? This map right here, you want to make sure that you are comfortable with this map. I think I put it on the note sheet so that you have a copy of it, but knowing where the countries are, where the points of conflict and kind of conflagration are going to occur, and then it also demonstrates like who the alliances are. So you've got the Triple Alliance, or the Central Powers as they're sometimes called eventually, the Triple Entente, and then the Russian allies are kind of out there as well, originally at least. Eventually this will all change, but by 1914 this is kind of what it looks like. So a little bit of economic context. This is going from 1870 to 1914. The first big thing is that this was a time of industrialization and overall expansion of economic growth. So nearly all the nations were experiencing economic growth, but they're generally at varying rates. Some would catch up with one another, some would really speed up, some would slow down, some would experience it for just a short amount of time. So for example, the former, what we call the former great powers of Austria-Hungary and Russia were starting to lag behind. As you go forward in this time period, you can see over here, by the time that we are reaching from 1900 right here to 1913, you've got Austria, Hungary, and Russia kind of, they had an upswing, and now they are tending to decline a little bit there. Britain took the lead by 1900 in terms of just like manufacturing output. So they did actually have a little bit, they are showing a little bit of a decline between 1900 and 1913, but by this kind of this time period right here, they're really leading things overall. You can see if the US kind of overtakes them, but in terms of Europe, Britain's going to be kind of the leading industrial power. By 1910, Germany led the European powers in industrial output, but Russia began to increase production of iron and steel. So Germany is a new country. You can see that they're on an upswing. Again, they're not quite to the point by 1900 that Britain is, but they are increasing overall. And in fact, by 1913, they've overtaken Britain in terms of manufacturing output. Most nations are also investing at this time in extensive railway networks to increase transportation, which is also going to be a benefit for any war efforts. The other thing that comes up a lot, especially in World War I, is the concept of nationalism. And it's always kind of been hard for me to explain what nationalism is, but a lot of people are saying that in America right now, you're seeing a kind of a growth of nationalism, especially over the last 4 years or so. So it's this kind of this idea, especially within these European nations that were so ethnically based in their territorial borders, that there was this ethnic and kind of national pride or solidarity, which increased a lot of feelings of competition with other nations. So at this time, you know, today we live in a very globalized society. There's a lot of ideas of global cooperation, but back then there was a lot of competition between nations. So this nationalism is this idea that it's sometimes referred to as a zero-sum game or zero-sum gain, which is this idea that if one country is benefiting from something, that means that another nation is going to be losing from something, that everybody cannot benefit at the same time. And that's a common thing that's been going on ever since the period of mercantilism in Europe. You also had some issues of military strength during this time. So many nations believed that if a war had to come, and I'm going to talk about this later because this was not something that was perceived as an inevitability, but if war were to eventually come, it would be better sooner than later before adversaries grew stronger. So you want to invest in your military. Caleb Allen can attest that in my 9th grade history class, we do this simulation called the balance of power. I would do it with you, but there's just not enough time to justify doing it. But everybody kind of just invests in their military. Nobody really invests in the economy of their country in this simulation. It's kind of similar. Economic growth is helping to fuel military strength, but people are also investing mass quantities of money in their military, especially in iron and steel, and then also new technology related to war efforts, transportation, railway networks, shipping, things like that. Military spending was also generally prioritized by a lot of European governments. So the rate of increase in size of standing armies in Britain and France and Russia was greater than that in Austria-Hungary and Germany in general, but eventually Germany, Austria-Hungary are going to start really increasing their troop levels. You also had naval rivalries, which is an important thing between two nations in particular, if you're not familiar. Kaiser Wilhelm II was determined when he rises to power to develop a navy to rival Britain's, and they passed the Navy Bill of 1900. I would say that's not something that you absolutely need to know, but it's definitely a piece of information that's helpful to know in understanding the development of the military during the 1900s. So they wanted to increase spending for the military, and then in response, Britain launched a new class of battleship called the Dreadnought in 1906, which was kind of seen by Germany as an affront to them, to the point that they started developing and purchasing dreadnoughts, and then would just literally leave them sitting out in the port so that everyone could see as like this, like they wouldn't really even go anywhere, they would just sit there, generally believed to be like a sign of strength and power in the region. You can see this is a graph of military spending over time. As you can see, like Germany's isn't, I mean, it definitely steadily increases over time, but it's not like, huge. You can see Britain has a bigger increase in between 1900 and 1905, and then even Russia is kind of being a really big increase as well. Again, steady increases in Austria-Hungary and Germany, but not to the extent of some of the other nations. And then here is the approximate number of standing armies that you can take a look at between 1900 and 1914. So take a look at that. You can see where the balance of power is kind of shifting militarily in the world, or in Europe in general. Probably the most complex of the long-term context and situations that's going on are the imperial rivalries. So there's two main places that this is happening, and the one that is actually probably less focused on in a survey course, but is probably actually more important to understanding like the nitty-gritty details, is the Balkan region. The Balkan region, if you're not familiar, is kind of this Eastern European region that is in between current Austria and Hungary and Turkey. So it's kind of like southeastern Europe, east of Italy. So it contains a variety of different countries. So at the time, you had Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Bosnia is a relatively new nation. Greece is somewhat considered to be part of this Balkan area. So imperialism, if you're not familiar, you don't remember from 9th grade, was kind of the dealing of empires. So these different nations developing empires and having these subsidiary, like quote unquote weaker nations that were underneath them. So for example, France, Britain, and Germany were really competing over access to Africa and Asia, but Russia and Austria-Hungary were really involved in the Balkan region, which is, again, southeastern Europe. So I'm going to give you some examples of that was going on, just to keep in the back of your mind as we go through some of the more short-term causes as well. So You had the imperial ambitions of Austria-Hungary, Russia, Serbia, and the Ottoman Empire. So this is Turkey, but Turkey during this time was like part of the broader Ottoman Empire. Serbia actually was a relatively new nation that just received its independence from the Ottoman Empire that was also looking to expand its influence. Generally, like in a survey course, we tend to think of Serbia as this like smaller country that was just kind of there, but they were actually fairly active in developing conflict. So again, Serbia, independence in 1817, Bulgaria in 1878, so relatively new nations. Austria-Hungary began looking to expand its control in the region in 1908, and this was kind of in reaction to this concept called Pan-Slavism, which is this idea, again, nationalistic, of this ethnic solidarity of the Slavic people, many of whom were in Russia and also in Serbia, but also spread throughout the Balkan region, because this was kind of a small smattering of countries that all kind of shared an ethnic heritage to some extent. So Serbia promoted a very nationalistic vision of this greater Serbia. So Serbia is really thinking about how can we extend our influence during this time period to other places in the Balkan region. And they had this saying that was like something like wherever there is a Serb, there is Serbia. So this idea that like all the ethnic Serbs should kind of be connected together in this greater Serbian region might, if you are a fan of history, sound familiar to another certain person that comes about in the 1930s and 1940s in Germany, thinking about ethnic solidarity. But leaving that alone, Serbia is promoting its nationalistic vision. Russia also has kind of this ideological interest in the area, so they see themselves as kind of the defender of the Slavic people. So economically, Russian influence in the Balkans is going to provide access to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. So Russia is kind of interested in making sure that they are able to maintain access to these regions down here, and the Balkans are a way to do that. Diplomatically, they want to limit the territorial expansion. So again, you've got this conflict between Austria-Hungary and Russia for territory, so it's territorial ambitions. So the Balkans are this area where you have these nations that are not super strong, that are independent, that various bigger powers are looking to extend control over. And then don't forget, you also have the Ottoman Empire that feels like they've lost a lot of territory that eventually are going to start thinking about, how do we regain territory? A little less complicated is the imperial rivalries in Africa. So the British Empire constituted about 20% of the world's territory by 1900. It was extremely massive. And France also had substantial interests in Africa. So both Britain and France, Britain a little more so in Asia than France, but also in Africa. But France has these substantial interests in Africa, which we'll take a look at in a second. But Germany, which had only come into an existence as a connection of Germanic states, comes together in 1871 and is also looking to exert influence. So Kaiser Wilhelm develops, well, he doesn't like by himself, but he's generally associated with this idea, which is Weltpolitik, which is this idea that Germany should exert its interest through acquisition of two things. First, a large navy, and then use it to gain colonies. So they don't really care if it's colonies that somebody already has claim to. So keep that in mind. This is one of those things that you don't necessarily need to know all the ins and outs of, but the Moroccan crises in 1905 and 1911 generally contributed to rising tensions between Germany and France regarding Northern Africa. So basically what was happening was France basically got the authority or the right from Spain to carve up pieces of Morocco, which is in northern Africa. Germany was really upset about this. They felt like they should have been consulted, and they were looking to gain a foothold in that territory as well. So what they did is they actually recognized Morocco as an independent country, and they supported popular uprisings, native uprisings within Africa, and or within Morocco in Africa, which made the French really upset. So you kind of have this like back and forth anger between France and Germany as a result of these crises that occur in 1905 and 1911, with Germany feeling like they're trying to sow some dissent and some instability, and France feeling like Germany is trying to usurp their authority in the region. And again, France and Germany they border each other, so there could be a conflict at any given time. Finally, one of the things that people generally look at as like the number one reason, but some historians and different perspectives would say this is a flawed assertion, is alliances. So you had a couple different things happening. And again, you don't need to know the history of these alliances, but you do need to know who was allied with whom during this time period. So you have the dual alliance, which is Germany and Austria-Hungary are pretty much tied together forever in love. Okay. So the dual alliance formed in 1878. This was a response to a decline in Russian and German or Russo-German relations. Germany and Russia had kind of gotten along, but you see a deterioration, especially as Russia is seeing kind of the expansionary efforts of Germany and Austria-Hungary in the regions. So Russia and France have shared anxieties regarding German expansion. So they formed the Franco-Russian alliance in 1894. So the first alliance is created is Germany and Austria-Hungary. And then later on, you have Russia and France together. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention Italy joins the Triple Alliance in 1882, but they end up actually kind of being backstabbers after the war starts. We'll get to that when we get into the war. But the dual alliance is the big thing that you need to be aware of. In 1904, Britain and France formed the Entente Cordiale, which is not a military alliance. It was not a military alliance. It was just a series of agreements regarding colonial influence. So they basically just kind of had an agreement about not competing with one another and not fighting with one another. 1904, sorry, I already said that. In 1907, Britain developed a similar agreement with Russia, so that paves the way with what you commonly learn about in a survey U.S. history course, which is the Triple Entente. Again, it's not a military alliance. It's just this idea that they're going to not compete with one another and generally have close economic ties. So you have Britain, France, and Russia, and then you also have this triple alliance of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy. Eventually, Italy will leave when the war gets going, but this is kind of the alliances you have together at the point where you have 1914. Okay? So back to our focus question, which is to what extent did long-term issues in Europe make World War more likely in 1914? So you can kind of see the seeds being planted here. This is, again, a broad overview, but think about what issues do you see as being most prevalent based on the evidence demonstrated? Because I would make the argument that not all of them, despite the fact that they're kind of like demonstrated in random, not random, but in different acronyms throughout history, like main or animal or things like that, I would argue that there are certain long-term concepts that are definitely more significant in developing tension than others. And I wanted to leave you on this note here, is that when we look back, all history kind of seems inevitable, especially the First World War. We generally look at it like, oh, all this stuff was just, there's a lot of gasoline lying around, like it's just waiting for somebody to light a match. But full-scale European war was actually unexpected in 1914. There's a couple ways that you can look at this. The first way is economic historians have looked at bond prices, which is generally can be construed as the relative faith business people, you know, like the quote unquote leaders of the world during the time, the relative faith they had in the stability of a nation. Bond prices were relatively stable during this time period. People did not, if people thought there was going to be a war that was going to occur inevitably in Europe, you would see a lot of fluctuation in bond prices, and you didn't really see that. The other thing is that if you were to go back and look at full-scale European war, you'd have to go back nearly 100 years to the Napoleonic Wars to see a time when all of Europe was engulfed in a war. The other thing is that random conflicts would crop up all the time with these different countries. You had the Balkan Wars in the early 1900s. You had the Moroccan crises, and a lot of these things would be figured out without having to resort to a long-term war. So war was actually relatively unexpected, at least to the scope of having a broad-scale, total European Avengers-style war. So we have a couple questions that I like to ask as we kind of get into these short-term causes. First off, what fail-safes were available to different nations, and why were they unable to contain this conflict like they had been able to contain other conflicts before it? Generally, this is kind of like when you think of like automobiles or machinery, there's generally like a governor that kind of oversees and tries to make sure that things don't overheat, so to speak. So what governors can we think of in this time period in Europe that failed to stop the war, and then who did expect the war, and did anyone like really want a world war? Were there people that actually had planned on it? Because we want to look at the motives of them as well, because obviously they saw it coming, and when a lot of other people didn't. So I'll leave you with some of those questions that we will explore a little bit more in class, but just make sure you understand the economic, diplomatic, imperialistic, and military kind of situations and context that's going on.